The Trump administration, that is 13 federal agencies working in coordination, released the fourth National Climate Assessment, a detailed document featuring the conclusions of more than 300 scientists that the planet is getting warmer, human activity is contributing to that warming, and we are approaching a point of no return in terms of catastrophic damage. It's a stunning document. It's also one that President Donald Trump himself doesn't buy.
I've seen it. I've read some of it, and I don't believe it. No, I don't believe it.
So then on Tuesday, White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders doubled down, claiming that the climate report was based on hysterical forecasting and not tied to reality, even though it came from their own administration.
And you have to look at the fact that this report is based on the most extreme modeled scenario, which contradicts long-established trends.
Well, actually, I've read some of the report, and it's based on a number of different scenarios, some more extreme, some less, and even the less extreme scenarios seem to predict damage to the economy and much more. So if we're to give the Trump administration any sort of sympathy for the way they blatantly deny science, it is true that this report is not something that anyone would want to believe. It says if climate change continues at its current pace, the United States will suffer major economic damage, more dire than the Great Recession. There will be losses from crop failures to severe disruptions to trade to major stress on critical infrastructure, even infrastructure that the president doesn't want to build. The report also confirms that a wide range of disasters, from wildfires and hurricanes to famine and disease, are the product of human-made changes to the environment. So we're not going to let the administration get away with burying this on the Friday of Thanksgiving weekend. We're going to come back to it here 6 days later and dive in some detail with Christopher Joyce, correspondent on the science desk at NPR. Christopher, thanks for giving us some one-on-one time here at WNYC. Hi.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Ryan.
So where do you start? Can you talk maybe a little bit about what I referred to, that there are different scenarios in this report? There are ranges of effects. If the model turns out to be true or turns out to be, best case scenario, worst case scenario, based on the carbon load that's already in the atmosphere?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to get in the weeds a little bit, but, warn me off if we get too far. There are basically, scientists tend to use 4 different scenarios, and they have numbers associated with them. They're called representative concentration pathways, but no, there won't be a quiz on that. RCP 2.6, 4.5, 6.0, 8.5. Basically, they range from 2.6 being, it reflects a world that really gets the act together and gets off of fossil fuels to sweet and gets into electric cars right away and does what scientists admit is a very unlikely, a very aggressive reduction of emissions. That's the rosy future out to 2100. 4.5 represents something more along the lines of what was agreed to in Paris at the International Climate Meeting, which is fairly aggressive reduction of fossil fuels, a fairly quick movement to more renewables. And then the 6.0 is a much less aggressive effort. And 8.5 is, as you mentioned, an extreme case. It is the worst case scenario, and that's the term that people use. Sometimes they say business as usual. And what the authors of the report did was they used 8.5 and 4.5, and in a few occasions 2.6. So they didn't use just the worst case scenario. But, as is often the case with people who are trying to deny the science of climate change, there's a kernel of truth there. 8.5 is an extreme case. It was used for some of these analyses, but as you said, the report, when you look into 1,600 plus pages of it, gives a representative range from which you can pick. And, 4.5 is the one that scientists usually tell me to pay attention to, and that's what I do. And in that kind of future, there will be significant effects, economic, weather effects, extreme weather. What scientists, I asked them, well, why do you use 8.5? It is, they often say, not very likely. that the world will do nothing. 8.5 represents doing absolutely nothing since 2010. And that's already obsolete because the world is doing quite a bit right now with the Paris Agreement. And they say, well, we like to have a range that shows what would happen if Paris fell apart, if the world decided not to do anything at all. It's there as an outside boundary. And so they use it. And, as you mentioned, the Trump administration is focusing on that. And there is a kernel of truth in that. But the fact is that the report does actually give a range. And when you look at the full range, it's all bad news. It's just some of it's worse.
Even in that middle range that you say is seen as the most likely, it's dire economically.
It's dire economically, although I think it's important to point out this is something that we decided at NPR not to do, which is what the New York Times wrote, was this number of 10% reduction in GDP by the end of the century. That is an 8.5 scenario. So again, back in the weeds, that is a worst case scenario. It actually does not occur in the text of the report. It comes apparently from one graph that was in the report that comes from a paper that was published in Science Magazine last year that was a sort of a look at all the possible futures, again, using all these scenarios. And most of them clustered around a much less economic effect than that, around 3 or 4%. One of the simulations came up with 10%. That showed up on the graph. That showed up in the paper, in a graph, but not in the text. The text of the economics report said hundreds of billions. So it's not as if, one can quibble over, is it 10%, 3%, 5%? It is serious economic damage. But I'm, at least for NPR, we're not using the 10% number, but it's certainly, the number we used was hundreds of billions of dollars of losses from GDP by 2090, by 2100.
And even at that more conservative reading of the report, I think it's striking that it's framed in terms of economics as much as it is, because what I think we see from the president and from climate policy skeptics, let's say, whether or not they're skeptics of the science, they say, well, the question of the trade-off is how much do we want to reduce global warming in exchange for how much damage to the economy, because it'll cost us more to do things that produce carbon and other greenhouse gases less. And so here comes this every 4-year national climate assessment mandated by Congress, and it frames a lot of it in economic terms, that, it would cost in crop damage, it would cost in lost labor, it would cost in other it would cost in damage to critical infrastructure that we would then need to pay to repair. And so I don't know if that's, a political strategic calculation as well as a pure economic one on the part of the National Climate Assessment. But one thing that seems to me important here is that it focuses the conversation not just on the overly simplistic equation that people use sometimes of climate versus the economy.
Well, yeah, and one of the things that they did in the text, the authors of the economics part of the report, was they took a look at what would happen with the worst-case scenario and the middle-of-the-road scenario in terms of economic damage, and they calculated the difference. And, there's going to be a loss even with the intermediate scenario, but it is so much less than it would be otherwise. And this is the calculation. I talked to some of the authors. They said this is what we wanted people to really understand, is that the choices that we make now, there's going to be some damage and there's going to be harm. We're already baked into a certain amount of climate change. But if you take the more aggressive course in reducing emissions, you're going to save a heck of a lot of money. And furthermore, what the scientists have been doing over the years, improving their models and informing them with more economic data, plus the fact that we are seeing the effects on weather, and which is the short-term version of climate. We're seeing more extreme events. We're able much better to perform something called attribution science, which is to say, okay, here's an event. It's a hurricane. Hurricanes have always happened. Can we attribute that event to climate change, or at least its severity? And that's a science that's becoming much more mature. And as scientists are able to say, yes, we can pick half a dozen events around the world now and say, like Harvey, for example, that we can all calculate how much worse it was because of climate change. Then you can start translating that into dollars and cents. Mm-hmm. And so this gives an economic edge to the science that it didn't used to have.
My guest is NPR science correspondent Christopher Joyce, and we can take your questions for him on the National Climate Assessment, which came out last Friday, a consensus report among 13 federal agencies working in coordination. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Maybe it's worth taking a step back when we talk about climate change, because I think we all know the basics of what makes the Earth warm up. It's the greenhouse effect. Human activity has increased the level of carbon dioxide in the air and other gases which slow down heat that would otherwise escape to space. But understanding how that trapped heat leads to these catastrophic effects is a little harder, I think, for people to wrap their heads around, because the report says human deaths will rise, insect-borne diseases will spread, wildfires will become more frequent. Can you explain in lay but scientific terms how an increase in just a couple of degrees Fahrenheit leads to such extreme realities?
Well, let's take what's going on in California, for example. When you get persistently hotter weather, even if on the average it's only a degree or two or three more than it used to be, but that also bumps up the extremes too. I mean, the whole weather regime moves to the right, if you will, and the right side of the graph is the warmer side. And what happens in the air as it gets hotter, and you get then also at the same time perhaps a drought, what scientists call higher vapor pressure deficit. So what that is basically the air is hotter and so much drier than the ground that it sucks the moisture out of the vegetation, out of the ground itself, and carries it away and turns California into one big tinderbox. And this is a direct result of simply higher average temperatures, even by a couple of degrees. It reduces the moisture level significantly enough so that California becomes more vulnerable. I should point out that the data so far do not show that wildfires are more common across the United States yet. However, large wildfires in the West are larger, so the number of large wildfires is going up, and the acreage burned is going up. So that's one example. Folks in New York, I'm sure you remember Sandy. The fact that sea level is higher than it used to be by about 9 inches it contributes to the level of water that came into the city that would not have flooded as much as it had just because of a few inches. Because when the ocean surges, even those few inches make a big difference over the distance it travels inland.